This week's episode is sponsored by Change. Change is the #1 mentoring program that teaches you e-commerce from scratch. Change has a real community with real results. I have been working with Ryan for many years now and have attended many of his events and retreats across the world and got to meet members and the amazing community of like-minded people. Ryan works with a lot of big names in the business world, helping them build online businesses and e-commerce. Change offers personal one-on-one support, no experience needed, but like anything, this takes time and is not a get-rich-quick scheme. If you put the work in, you will get the results. E-commerce and online shopping is getting bigger and bigger. This is a great opportunity for anyone that is looking for financial freedom. For more information, go follow Ryan on Instagram at RyanJB, and he will guide you through the steps to help you get started and build a successful online business. You can now follow me on all my social media platforms to find out who my latest guest will be. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you're notified for when my next podcast goes live. And boom, we're on. And today's guest, we've got David Arrowsmith. How are you, David?
Yeah, very well, thanks, James. Thanks for having me on.
First and foremost, thanks for coming on the show. You sent me a book a couple of months ago. Great read, very fascinating. A lot of stuff about Escobar that I didn't know. The book is called Narco, Love, Death and Football in Escobar's Colombia. I'll just read this little bit, which is Narco uncovers the incredible story of Colombian football during the late 1970s, 80s and 90s when drug cartels began to get involved with their local clubs. It led to corruption, kidnapping, ultimately murder. It also leads to the rise in both club and national football fortunes, and one of the most notorious episodes in world football. David Arrowsmith uncovers a new story of Pablo Escobar and his rivals, one that unveils the extraordinary bonds that Escobar forged with football's luminaries and why his influence reached unprecedented heights, leading to an astonishing 5-0 victory over Argentina, the murder of referees and the ruthless coercion of officials, culminating in the killing of Andres Escobar, the Colombian defender who paid the ultimate price for an own goal in the 1994 World Cup. It is also an examination of people's relationship with the sport and the leaders that brought both pride and terror to their communities. Fascinating. Like I say, there's not, obviously when you read books and stuff, but you're gripped in because obviously the true crime stuff is a big hitter, but very important. How are you so connected to this? Because I believe you're half Colombian, is that correct?
That's right, yeah. You wouldn't know it maybe from my name or from my accent. I grew up in London, but my mum was Colombian. My dad is British, so I grew up in southwest London in a sort of Anglo-Colombian household. My mum was very, very patriotic about her motherland. She left in her 20s. She had been born in Medellin and grew up in Bogota. And I grew up with a half brother and a half sister who are 100% Colombian by birth and had come to England with my mother. And so I grew up surrounded by Spanish-speaking family. I grew up with my mother taking me to Colombia to see my family and to see my roots as a very young child. We went back several times during the 80s until really the violence got too much and it got a bit too dangerous at the kind of height of Escobar's war with the authorities. So I grew up in that household. And as I kind of grew into my skin as a young boy, I kind of embraced my Colombian heritage more and more. I think as you get a bit older, you start to try to find what identifies you as a person, and you stop trying to be the same as everybody else, and you start to want to find out, who you are and what makes you you. And I think my Colombian heritage was a big part of that for me. And a big part of that was also football. I grew up loving football, watching football, playing football, played football kind of 7 days a week throughout my teenage years. And my mum took me to my first football match. It was at Old Wembley. And it was the Rouse Cup. It was, I think, a three-way tournament between England, Scotland, and they would invite another international team to join it in a kind of triangular tournament. And in 1988, it was Colombia, and it was the first time they'd ever come and played in the UK. It was the first time they ever played at Wembley. And my mum took me and a bunch of my mates. I think we must have been about 7 or 8. And she'd got the tickets through the Colombian network and the Colombian FA in the UK. And so we were sat up in the gods in Old Wembley with all the Colombian fans. And that was my first experience pretty much of live football. And it was René Higuita, Carlos Valderrama, and the manager was Pacho Maturana. And so I grew up increasingly feeling Colombian. I watched Italia 90, every game on the telly, both England games and Colombia games. And that was a good tournament for Colombia. And then I watched USA 94, and that wasn't a good tournament for Colombia. And I think writing this book really came out of that sort of teenage trauma of supporting this country in this huge World Cup in America in 1994 when I was 14, about to turn 15, and sort of seeing what went wrong on the pitch and then trying to understand the things that might have happened off the pitch that might have caused that and might have caused the death of Andres Escobar afterwards. So I was a teenage boy who loved football. I was a teenage boy who loved Colombia, and 30 years or so later, this book appeared.
Yeah, fascinating read. Like I say, there's a chapter in this book, Narco Terrorists. Like, very interesting, a lot of stuff that I didn't know. I've interviewed so many different people on Escobar, but there's a lot of stuff in this book uncovered that I, like I said, didn't know. You're very good journalist as well. You've done documentaries as well, like Nobel Peace Prize, you think you've been involved in, which we'll touch on later on. But fascinating read. Where can people buy this book?
So Narco Ball is out anywhere you can get your books, really. There's a hardback in the UK. There's a trade paperback all around the world. It's on audiobook as well and ebook. You can get it hopefully in your local bookshop. If not, ask them to get a copy, but you can find it anywhere online, anywhere you get your books.
Before we get into all the corruption and Escobar, I always like to go back to the start with my guests, get more of a bit of understanding about you, David, where you grew up and how it all began.
Yeah, so I kind of explained it a bit in my previous answer, which was probably a bit long. I hope listeners are still tuning in. Yeah, I grew up in London, but I grew up feeling very much my motherland's pull, the pull of my mother, who actually passed in August, and she just was able to. Oh, thank you. She was able to see the book published, and that was really important for me. She helped me when I was putting it together. I think I kind of won her over. I think she felt maybe it might just be another book on Escobar, and I was very conscious there's been a lot written and broadcast and said about Pablo Escobar. But I think what she saw by the time the book was ready was that really this was my love letter to Colombian football. That growing up as a teenage boy, seeing Higuita, Valderrama, Faustino Asprilla, who was sort of my idol as a teenage boy, watching
Newcastle
him play.
boy.
Yeah,
he was a fucking nutcase.
He was a nutter. He played for Parma. And I used to watch Serie A football on Saturday and Sunday mornings on Channel 4, so I could watch him playing for Parma. And then he came to Newcastle. He was the first Colombian ever to play in the Premier League, and he was the best Colombian player at the time. And he arrived and got a great assist on his debut coming off the bench. I think he'd drunk a bottle of red wine on his way to the game because he wasn't expecting to play. And then Keegan threw him on half cut, and he did a nice Cruyff turn and got an assist to help get them back in the game. So I grew up as a teenage boy loving football, feeling increasingly Colombian, going through that period really of the early 90s of Italia 90 World Cup, Higuita and Roger Milla against Cameroon, and then the USA 94 events and the aftermath of that. And then it was only many years later when I was thinking about those events and the story of Pablo Escobar and the story of Colombian football. And I was working, as I was until a couple of years ago, in documentary television. And I was looking for stories that combined sports with something else, stories that were bigger than just being a sports story, a sports documentary, but that spoke to a bigger truth. And this was the most personal of the ideas that I came up with. It was very much born out of my childhood. And it was the idea to tell the story of Colombian football, really from start to finish, and also the life and death of Pablo Escobar, and to show how those two things were inextricably linked and came to a head in the late 80s and early 90s. And as I researched it, I found out more about his involvement and his influence and some of the things that happened in domestic and not just international football.
What was your thoughts on Escobar in the 80s? Because he's known as a hero as well with a lot of people, as a Robin Hood type figure, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Like, what was your thought process in the 80s?
I mean, I was a young boy, and I was over here in London, and I was quite, I was very lucky to be isolated and insulated and protected from most of what was going on. Like I say, my exposure to it really was going to Colombia when I was 6 months old, a year old, 2 years old, 6 years old, that kind of thing, semi regularly with my mother, and seeing, armed army and armed police everywhere, and seeing high security and overhearing conversations about, bombings and kidnappings and things like that. But, I was pretty safe living in London. And I didn't go through a lot of the trauma that Colombians living in Colombia went through at the time. And I'm very conscious of that. I think for most Colombians, I would say, Pablo Escobar was not a good guy. I think most people would take that as read. I think that there were some people back then, and there possibly still are some now who feel that he did certain things and might feel some loyalty to him or some gratitude to him for certain things. And that was a big challenge with writing the book, really, was kind of coming to terms with where to draw the line in terms of giving him any kind of credit for any positive outcomes from things that he did. He did do things that benefited people, and some of those things benefited the poorest and most marginalized in Colombian society, and in particular in the poorest parts of Medellin, where he was based and where he grew up. So he did have a positive impact. To be honest, as a child, I didn't hear much about that, and I don't think many people outside of Colombia did. He was a billionaire narco terrorist drug dealer, and he was pretty much the biggest, baddest guy out there. It was only really researching this book that I got to understand a little bit more about what he did and why he might have done it and what his motivations were. And like I say, I don't think they were altruistic. I don't think he was doing these things out of the kindness of his own heart. He did a lot of things like build hospitals, build schools, build football pitches, bring electricity to communities that on the surface seemed like he was helping the most disadvantaged in society. But I think he did almost all of those things with quite a cold, calculating idea of how he could gain personally from that. And that was to get loyalty and protection and power.
Do you think it's harder for people to accept any positives because of the destruction it did cause? But like I say, if you're giving people power and education, like, it is a positive as well. Like, you'll see a lot of these dictators and leaders now who do the exact same. Like, you can go down the Gaddafi route or whatever and look at the positives that they created for their community and their countries if people actually knew the truth. Like I say, the media obviously done a lot of bad things. I'm not sticking up for the man, but obviously I'm trying to be on the fence to look at it in all aspects, to judge of he did good, he did bad. I can see why people loved him as well. But like you say, was it all a sense of power? Was it all a big control game?
I think that's what it was, yeah.
How does a young kid, because in the book it says he was raised in a family, how does a young kid then become one of the biggest, and if people would say best businessmen on the planet? Like, he was so ahead of his time, like, to be in the 80s and be a billionaire. Like, there was not many people like that. So how does a young kid from a farm then make the waves to become one of the biggest entrepreneurs on the planet, if you could say an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, he was a trailblazer. He did things his own way, and he did them ruthlessly and brilliantly and efficiently in many, many ways. He moved as a young boy from the kind of countryside to Medellin, which at the time was a kind of bustling, busy, slightly lawless city that was kind of growing, but had, issues with crime and unemployment and poverty. And it was kind of the perfect crucible, I think, for him to learn the criminal ropes and kind of work his way up. If you were so minded, you could do that. And he clearly fell in with people who took him under their wing and introduced him to the world of smuggling. He started off, very petty crimes himself, and then as he got a bit older and he got to know dodgier people, they got him into smuggling. He was involved in smuggling cigarettes, which was a huge industry, contraband cigarettes in Colombia. I think he got involved in the marijuana trade. And then what really changed his life, Colombian history, world history really, was the explosion in cocaine. Up until, the kind of early 70s, marijuana was perhaps the big drug, much harder to grow and produce and sell and make profit because of the quantities needed. And he saw this opportunity in cocaine to make an awful lot of money. It was you could make much more money from much smaller transported shipments. And Colombia had the perfect setup for that he could exploit in terms of kind of geography, corruptibility potentially, and he exploited basically a massive downturn in the global coffee trade. See, Colombia also famous for making coffee, huge industry there. And when the coffee industry kind of collapsed, it created a vacuum, and that was sort of filled by cocaine and growing coca and processing cocaine. And he sort of maxed that out really and turned that into a multi-billion-dollar industry.
How does a one-man kid, like you say, from the farm, selling cigarettes, I think stealing cars, like sets up this organisation? Because in the book it says 1976 he started the Medellin cartel, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is the sort of the cartel was loosely a kind of cooperative in a way. There were several of them involved, and he was never sort of elected or voted or chosen to be the leader, but I think just through the force of his personality, he kind of became the de facto leader of this group, this sort of cooperative. And what was clever is, he built, as many of these organized crime organizations and syndicates are, and I know you've had a lot of guests who've talked about the mafia, for example, both in the US, the mob, and the Italian mafias. In many ways quite similar to that, and very clever that it had different people with different skill sets, different connections that performed different roles that enabled this kind of management team, as it were, of the Medellin cartel to manage, creating the product, marketing the product, distributing the product, selling the product. So he brought these people together. I think he was quite a charismatic person when he wanted to be. I think he was a real personality, and I think through a combination of charm and, putting the fear of God into people, he was a very powerful manipulator of people and able to control people. And so he could build an organization that really he was the leader of.
Did he used to kidnap, in the book as well, says that he used to kidnap people for ransom at the start when he was a kid?
Yeah, it's been a big problem in Colombia for many, many years. Kidnapping was something that took off when people realized, I think, that you could kidnap a wealthy person or the child of a wealthy person or the relative of a wealthy person and hold them for ransom. And it was actually, quite a relatively quick way to make potentially quite a lot of money. And it's something that he then carried through into kidnapping referees, not for money, but for intimidation purposes. And it was always quite a difficult thing in Colombia in that period in the 80s and 90s, because the government made paying ransom to kidnappers illegal to try to stop it happening so much, to try to make it less of a quick way for people to make money. But obviously when you're the family of someone who's been kidnapped and you're being told that you have to pay this much money to get them back alive, I think it's very hard to ignore that and necessarily automatically to go to the authorities and trust the authorities, when maybe back then there wasn't an awful lot of trust always in the police and the military, not least because they to some extent had been infiltrated by Pablo and the cartels.
When did they start making serious money? Because they used to go, is it Bolivia and stuff, all the South American places, and then obviously Miami. New
Yes.
York. How long did it take him to hit America?
It started off, like you say, they were kind of importing, and once they got control of the infrastructure for growing and processing and cutting and packaging the cocaine in country in Colombia, and then they set up. I think one of the biggest benefits that they found from the cartel was partnering with a guy called Carlos Leda, who basically took charge of their transportation and ran planes in and out of the Bahamas. And they would fly the coke there, and then from there they would fly on to Miami. And that American market that exploded in the early 80s, and a market that ended up being at least partially controlled for Pablo, with a sort of uneasy alliance with Griselda Blanco, who your listeners might know from the Netflix series that was on recently. That US market was obviously the huge market. That was where they made their money. I think he would make from his Miami operation $50 to $70 million a weekend from selling cocaine in Miami in clubs. So once he had that pipeline from Colombia straight into America and that distribution network in Miami, they were making millions and millions of dollars. And he was 3 years in a row in the Forbes top 10 or top 50 richest men in the world. I think in 1989, I think it was, he was the 7th richest man on the planet, as estimated by the Forbes rich list. So he was a billionaire, one of the richest and most powerful men in the world, but he was also a drug dealer and a terrorist.
When did they start getting the fame? Like you see, being on the Forbes list as a drug dealer, because if you ever watched the film American Gangster, what was the man's name again? Frank Lucas. He was noticed because he flew under the radar, made so much money, but when he went to the boxing match, I think he had the fur coat on, and he was sitting in better seats than the celebrities. That's when the police started investigating him and started understanding that he was one of the biggest drug dealers. Like, did he want to be at the forefront of his fame, or did it just so happen that it become a public figure and people people love crime, people love gangsters. It doesn't matter how much destruction they've had, the murders, the drugs. All his drugs would have killed millions of people all around the world. So people still love them, including myself. I love the crime ones. I love interviewing the old gangsters, the old hitmen. There's just something towards it. Every man thinks they're a bad man, but when you actually sit across from one, you realise you're not. But these people were proper. Like, did he enjoy the limelight at the start? Like, for a man who was quite intelligent, must have been trained, like you say, by one of the richest men on the planet. But why could he have not kept under the radar, or did he glow towards the kind of fame side of things and being like a celebrity gangster?
I think he very much gravitated towards the fame. It's an interesting contrast between him, for example, and the Cali cartel, who in many ways kind of surpassed the Medellin cartel in terms of their operation. And they were actually in partnership with the Medellin cartel, and they ended up having distribution into New York, and that became a huge market. And I think they very much like to treat it as business, to fly under the radar. They just wanted to get as rich as possible, sell as much drugs as possible, with as little interference as possible. And so their sort of MO was very much on the quiet, doing everything to stay, as you say, under the radar. Pablo is a very different beast, a very different animal. I think he loved the limelight. I think he, before he really went into football in a big way, I think his main ambition was to be president of Colombia. And I think that's something maybe that people in the West are not as aware of, that he had a whole political career. He ran for public office. He was elected. In his local area as a suplente, which is like a stand-in for the MP, basically. So when the representative was not available to go to Parliament, he would step in and he'd be the representative, the sort of the backup, as it were. And that he was an elected politician, and that meant he was protected from criminal prosecution. And it also meant he was protected from extradition to America, which was a big thorn in the side of Colombian criminals in this period and a big political bone of contention that you could be sent to America to face trial for your crimes in the US judicial system. And I think that was Pablo's biggest fear. But I think he thought he could be above the law. He could be so big, he could be so rich, so famous, so powerful, not flying under the radar, but being right out there, that he could be above the law, he could be protected. And I think his first ambition to do that, once he realized he was, getting very rich, getting very powerful and very influential, was to try and become president, and at the very least to kind of start this political career. And around that time, he was getting quite well known for his altruistic, in inverted commas, activities in Medellin for helping people. And I think people knew that his money potentially was coming from dodgy places, but, we're not asking too many questions. And there was a famous article where he was described in the headline in a big, massive Colombian magazine at the time, as the Antioqueñan Robin Hood, and Antioquia is the region where Medellin is, where Pablo is from. And he was described as this kind of local Robin Hood figure who was helping the poorest and the most marginalized. I think he loved that. He loved the attention from the press. He loved the idea of being president. He loved the idea of opening football stadia and, being the center of attention. And that was something that I think was one of his kind of fatal flaws, really, that brought the spotlight on him and on the Medellin cartel, and kind of led to his downfall. Smart
though, with the politician to then have the pardon, not to get extradited, not to go to prison. So I always wondered why he couldn't get jail. Obviously, I knew he was paying a lot of police officers and I knew he was involved in politics, but I didn't know he had the pardon where he couldn't be arrested. He must have paid a lot of money for that, or was he voted in?
I think he was voted in, but I don't think he got voted in without spending a lot of money in a lot of different ways. Like I say, he had helped a lot of those local communities. And so, as I said, that investment was not entirely altruistic. I think he was effectively buying love and loyalty and votes. Yeah. And so he could run on that ticket of being the local self-made businessman, in inverted commas, who was helping poor people. And he helped to mobilize that poor and working class vote to get behind him, to back him as a sort of liberal politician of change. But it was very, very clever. His biggest fear was extradition to America. And he managed to kind of protect himself from that until the point at which very, very early on in his real political career, he was kind of publicly outed as being a narco, a drug trafficker, a drug dealer, a criminal. And as soon as that happened, it all kind of, the political dreams just went up in smoke. That was it, really. He effectively retired from politics immediately. Meant he was no longer protected from prosecution, no longer protected from extradition. And in my research and in my kind of attempt to get under his skin and understand his motivations, and writing the book, I feel like around that time was when he pivoted from politics to football as a kind of alternative way to protect himself. If he couldn't be protected by the Constitution that would protect him as an elected representative, then if he could bring glory to Colombian football, if he could win the hearts and minds of the Colombian people through the game that the country is obsessed with, that he would, in a different way, be sort of too big and be insulated from prosecution and persecution.
Yeah, so do you think all the stuff that he'd done for love was kind of because his psychotic kind of behaviour to then have more power over people? Do you think it was just all a game for his own gain kind of thing, where none of it meant anything? Like you say, the Robin Hood, when you read articles, like, I think there's 20,000, 25,000 at his funeral, but do you think these people have just been kind of blinded by they were getting used to then so he could have some support and everything was really for his own personal gain?
I think so. I mean, I'll never know. He died in 1993. I obviously didn't speak to him for this book. But I think when you look at the things he did, the way he operated, understand the person he was, I think almost everything was calculated, was for his own benefit, was his way of manipulating, controlling, having power over people. He clearly had a huge amount of love in his own way for his family. He would fight for his family, for his wife and his children. But I don't think that kind of behavior stops you potentially from being a sociopath or a psychopath. I think you can still feel that emotion if you're, if you think that something you value or treasure or think that you should value or treasure is being threatened, then a psychopath would equally want to protect against that, I think. So I'm not a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist, but in trying to understand him, I think the one thing that was a little thread that I felt was something that would help me understand him and write this book was that I do think one thing that he did really love was football. And that's kind of how this book came about, really, was that idea that he grew up, allegedly his first boots were football boots. When he was shot and he was running away, he had football boots on. He grew up kicking a plastic bag filled with rags and scraps of clothing instead of a football, because he didn't have a football as a young kid, and he would kick that around with his brother Roberto. And then as he got rich and powerful, everywhere he went, he would make sure he had a football pitch, a goal, somewhere he could kick a ball, even while he was doing his business. And he would be kind of doing that whenever he could. And he would fly players out to the ranches to play matches with him or to play matches for him that he would kind of bet on with his cartel friends. And he even flew Diego Maradona to his prison and played behind closed doors a prison game of football with Maradona and partied with Maradona. And I think he loved football. I think he kind of fancied himself as a football player. And I think that was something I could sort of identify with him on. I think, if I had somehow ended up being a billionaire narco terrorist drug lord and I had all the money that God could give you, would I have wanted to play football with Maradona? Probably I would. Would I have wanted to have a full-size football pitch on my ranch so I could play games with the Colombian national side and, with my friends? I think I would. So it was something I discovered about him, that throughout his life, he had this intersection with football. And I don't think it was coincidence. And I don't think it was, when it came to the clubs in Medellin that he bankrolled, I don't think it was purely money laundering. He did also invest funds in those teams. He did want them to be successful. He would attend matches while he was on the run in costume, in a disguise, so that he could watch games. He would listen to Medellin matches and Colombian football matches on a portable radio, in a ditch while on the run from the authorities. And I don't think you do all those things if you don't have some sort of genuine passion for the game. So I think he loved football. I think he loved his family in his own way. But I think he also loved money and power and fame. And I think he would do pretty much anything to get those things.
What one do you think you loved the most? Power?
Probably power. I think his sort of, maybe his purest love, I would like to think, was football. Maybe deep down, for those of us that love football, it is a pure love, I think. But I think that was trumped by power. I think it was all, I think with a lot of these super criminals that I think in the modern world we are quite fascinated by and obsessed with, that is really the ultimate pursuit, is the pursuit of power, and everything else feeds into that. The money, the fame, the control, the corruption, all of those things are tools and sort of part of an armory designed to give you ultimately power. I think.
So you speak about the Cali cartel. They were more organised, made more money, flew under the radar. They must have loved someone like Pablo then, because it would have took all the heat away from them. He would have had all the attention. He would have been public enemy number one. Like, were they thankful for him because they then flew under the radar more?
A little bit. It was a very complicated relationship that they had, I think. The leaders of that cartel, the Rodriguez brothers, and the Cali cartel, and Pablo and Medellin, in the beginning, they were kind of partners. They were exploiting this opportunity and this market together, really. It was kind of them versus the authorities and the system. And they were working out how to divvy that up and how to work together to maximize their power and their profits. And like I say, initially Pablo had Miami and then Carly had New York. And then Pablo got quite jealous of New York and he tried to kind of muscle in and get hold of New York and take that away from Carly. Around that time, I think they fell out. I think to some extent what you said is true, that it was helpful for Carly that the spotlight was much more on Pablo and in the Medellin cartel. But I think in general, that just brought the spotlight on cocaine traffickers and on Colombia. And what it really did was it brought the US into the equation and it brought the DEA into Colombia. It launched the war on drugs. And with President Bush's arrival, that kind of really ramped up as well. And so I think actually they were quite angry with Pablo for, one, maybe not keeping their promises to him, but two, maybe bringing a lot of heat and attention to their industry that they was trying to keep quiet. And even though he was the main focus, I think they saw that it wasn't helping them. And they were quite right that once he was dead, focus immediately switched to the Cali cartel. And within 18 months or so of Pablo's death, the two brothers behind the Cali cartel were arrested. So I think they had very different attitudes. They fell out massively. And there were some strong links between the Cali cartel and this armed group called Los Pepes, who were part of the effort to hunt down Pablo and destroy the Medellin cartel. And they were a kind of illegal armed group that could operate outside the auspices of the law. And would basically just go after Pablo and all his men and murder members of the cartel, murder their families, very publicly kind of display the bodies in their hunt to put pressure on Pablo. And that there are a lot of links, I think, between that group and the Cali cartel. I think they were quite keen by the late 80s, early 90s to get rid of Pablo.
See, I'm surprised he wasn't took out earlier. It's not as if he couldn't have been. He was quite open and everywhere. Obviously had his army around him. I had a man on, old SAS man, sadly passed away, God rest his soul, but he was offered, he went to meet his friend from the SAS in the pub. He says, listen, I've got £1 million contract to go and kill Pablo Escobar. And he says, yeah, I'm in. They got a helicopter. They were going to his ranch or something to kill him.
That's
SAS men. And while on the route to kill him, their helicopter crashed. I forget that old guy's name. Peter Macalise.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah, people think he's full of shit, but it was legit. Like, it's 100% legit. And how can they get the jurisdiction and, like you say, the authorities, if people can go and kill him in Colombia? Like, was it just a target on his head for anyone to get?
I think there were many years when there was a huge target on his head, and like I say, it became increasingly difficult for him because it wasn't just the authorities, it wasn't just the Colombian police and the army, and also the American DEA, who set up in Colombia a task force to capture him, and increasingly had more and more technology at their disposal to try and capture him. But it was also the Cali cartel and Los Pepes who were prepared to try and kill him, but didn't care about trying to arrest him or anything like that. And like you say, the Macalise story is an amazing story. It nearly succeeded, but crashed because of the geography, I think, as he tells it, of the mountains as they approached in the helicopter. The pilot didn't quite get it right and they crashed. So there were a lot of people who wanted Pablo caught or dead. I think it's a weird testament to his determination to survive and his probably not entirely unfounded paranoia that he survived for so long. He went to enormous lengths to survive. There was a period where he was in his prison that he designed and effectively had built himself, where he surrendered to the authorities. And he stayed there and he was quite safe there. But I think that was where the Macalise attack, I can't remember if it was there or if it was one of his ranches, but he felt quite safe there for a while. And then I think he realized that it got to a point where if he was anywhere for too long, it was going to get quite dangerous for him. I think he thought the authorities were going to come and either arrest him and move him or potentially just kill him. and he escaped. And then once he was on the run, he went to enormous lengths, but it took a long time for him to be found, and that he was eventually killed rather than apprehended.
Do you think that was the plan?
There's a lot of rumors about that. You could never quite rule it out that it might just be quicker and easier and cleaner to have a dead body than to have to go through a big trial that could take years. Then again, I think authorities quite often want to see somebody take the stand, and for the public to get their pound of flesh and see somebody sent down for life, for example. I don't know. It's shrouded, like many things with Pablo, in kind of doubt and rumor and innuendo. And there are people who believe that actually he killed himself. That the fatal shot, which I think entered behind his ear, wasn't made by one of the police or army marksmen, but was actually, he put his own gun to his head and took his own life. And I don't know if that's true, but if it is, it kind of fulfilled his own prophecy that, he very famously said he'd rather a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in America. So you can imagine that if he thought in that final moment he was about to be captured and he might be extradited and sent to America, that if he had the opportunity and if he really thought that was the end of it, he might have killed himself. But I don't think anyone has really proved that either way.
But to be involved in that life for nearly 20 years, what do you think of the possibility that because if the Americans want you, they can get you. No matter what army you've got in front of you, police or whatever, the Americans are the elite. They're the best, if not the best in the world. But if they really wanted a man dead, they could get him done. So what do you think of the kind of thing where they believe that they're plants to let them get in, feed the place with drugs, more police, more prisons, more destruction in the world, where they just keep letting these people have a free reign until they eventually take them out and then take over and make the money themselves? Like, I've had FBI agents on, CIA, who says like it's all run, the drug industry's run by people in power. Like, what do you think of that idea? Do you think that's a bit far-fetched?
I mean, to be honest, I love a conspiracy theory as much as the next man. I think, they're great drama, they're great intrigue. And I think there is some precedent in history for some of that. Again, I'm not an expert on all of American foreign policy, but there are a lot of opinions around the Vietnam War and the kind of introduction of drugs into the ghettos in America. Exactly. I probably stand slightly more on the side of the kind of authorities or kind of the prevailing opinion rather than conspiracy opinion on all of that, on some of that. But I think in terms of Colombia, I think it was a very difficult theater of operations for America. I think they had a limited remit and limited resources there. They had a few DEA guys and they were training the Colombian, special forces and stuff. But I think it was unlike most of the other environments that they'd had to operate in. And I think a big part of that was also Pablo's power and influence and his money. And, there was corruption. There were people in the police and in the army who were tipping Pablo off, who were, kind of giving false leads and helping him. And I think it took everybody responsible for kind of trying to bring him down a long time to try to weed some of those people out, to create a closed group that was safe and secure, to find the right techniques to track him down. He had so many different safe houses that he would move between constantly. He would wear disguises. He would change his vehicles. He would change his routine. He would change his drivers. He would use radio phones to try and avoid being tracked and traced. And it was only in the end the kind of use of some triangulating technology that they belatedly got hold of and were able to use, combined with some kind of spy planes, that were able to finally let them hone in on him. And it was only really because he kind of slipped up. He was missing his family. He'd been separated from his family for a long time. He'd been on the run. He was trying to communicate with his son. And I think at one point, one of the police or army responsible for guarding the family whose lives were at risk for various reasons, I think spotted the frequency that the son's handset was tuned to, and had an inkling that he'd been communicating with his father and was able to pass that information on. And that got fed back, and it helped them to hone in on Pablo, and they were able to kind of, as it were, radio locate him to within a certain area. And then they just happened to get very, very lucky that they spotted him when they did that. So I think, he went to enormous lengths to run, to hide, to survive. Once he was in that survival mode, which he was for the last kind of 18 months of his life, he had to do everything he could. But the net kind of closed in on him. More and more of his men were killed, arrested, gave themselves up, turned witness. And it sort of eventually became a law of diminishing returns, and he was going to get
It was
gone.
only a matter of time. How much wages was he actually paying out? Because I'd imagine they've been paying politicians, police, army, intelligence, surveillance to then keep himself safe. Like, how many people were actually in his team to protect him?
I mean, his payroll must have been astronomical, and like you say, he was paying out huge amounts in bribes, in kind of retainers, in rewards for people being killed. He was also funding, a terror campaign effectively. He was funding the planting and detonating of bombs around the country. He had a passenger jet, a Colombian Avianca plane, blown out of the sky, killing over 100 people because he wanted to kill one politician who ended up not getting on that plane in the first place. So part of the problem he had was he had built this business and this infrastructure that did have huge overheads, and cocaine trafficking, was predominantly a illegal cash business, right? So how do you look after all that cash? How do you launder that money? Where do you put it? And he had money rotting in the fields, being eaten by rats, being hidden in houses and kind of then forgotten about. But as it all started to crumble for him, I think it became harder and harder for him to lay his hands on the kind of money that he needed to be able to maintain that network to protect him. And so as the government started to seize his assets and his ranches and freeze anything of value to do with him, that was a big struggle for him, was where could he get hold of enough ready cash to bribe people, to keep people on his payroll, to keep people loyal. Because if a lot of your loyalty is bought and then your money supply starts to run out, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah. The story with when he built his own prison and that, how did they end up on the run for that to hand himself in? What was the charge for that? Because that was back in the day. I think there was a reward of like millions of pounds for him, or was it pesos maybe? But what's the story behind that?
So it was all part of his desire to avoid extradition, basically. And the government had introduced into law something that appealed to him, which was that he could effectively plead guilty to just one charge and get a greatly reduced jail term if he kind of handed himself in. And he would also be protected from extradition. So he kind of did a deal with a complicit government at the time, effectively, where he said, look, I'll stop the war. I'll hand myself in as long as you don't give me a really hefty jail term and you don't send me to America. And actually, my other condition is that I don't want to go into just some general prison in Colombia. What I'm going to do is I've found this piece of land just outside Medellin up in the hills, and I've got an idea of how we could build a prison there, and that's where I'll go. And he basically did that deal with the authorities, who I think just felt they needed the violence to end. They needed the war that he was waging on the state to end. They needed some kind of result, and they weren't getting anywhere close to capturing him or building a case really against him that would stick. So he did this deal to hand himself in, and he did, but he was transported to this prison that he had effectively signed off on himself. And then while he was there, he was able to get back up to his old smuggler's tricks that he'd learned, when he was working his way up the Colombian criminal underworld. And he just smuggled whatever he wanted into that prison. And a lot of the guards were on his payroll or under his control. And he made it into his new ranch, basically. He had pretty much whatever he wanted. He'd get girls in there, drugs, booze, guns, money. He smuggled footballers in. He smuggled Maradona in. Rene Higuita used to go and visit him. And basically what happened was, it was this sort of gilded cage from which he could just carry on life as usual. Okay, he didn't have ultimate freedom. He couldn't go anywhere he wanted and do anything he wanted, but he just carried on running his business. And he took with him a bunch of his kind of henchmen and lieutenants. And between them, they had, by all accounts, a pretty rum old time in there, living it up and continuing to make money and continuing to run their global cocaine operation. And it was only really when the truth of that became undeniable, when the press and the public got wind of the extent to which he was just carrying on as usual, to the extent of even not just being visited by famous footballers like Rene Higuita, which was a big embarrassment, I think, for the authorities, but also either killing or having killed senior members of his own cartel who he suspected of keeping money from him. And when that happened, I think the authorities thought, we can't carry on this charade anymore. Like, the public is against us now. The public have seen through this artifice of the idea that Pablo is somehow being punished for his crimes. He's not, he's continuing them. And so at that point, they decided to go in, and the story is that they were going to go in and move him. They were going to take him from this prison of his own design and take him somewhere much more secure where they could control him, keep an eye on him, and stop him doing what he was doing. And when that was in the process of happening, Pablo basically escaped. He got himself out of his prison in a bit of a kind of, there was a big distraction going on. There was gunfight, and he kind of slipped out the back and ran into the hills, in the kind of dark and the mud up the hill. And so he made his escape from La Catedral, and from that point onwards, he was on the run. So it was all a kind of tacit agreement with the government, but it got to a point where it became too embarrassing for them, I think.
But why stay in the run if he knew? Did he think he was going to kind of stay away from capture, or he must have been smart enough to realise he was going to get caught? Why not finish his sentence and take it on the chin?
Yeah, I think he thought he could just carry on doing whatever he wanted, and he was doing that. And I think, the missteps were flaunting it so publicly. I think every now and again, he just went too far, and he didn't really prepare. He thought he could get away with absolutely anything, and there were certain things that he did that just meant that the public opinion was so great that it brought all that pressure on him. So I think he thought he could have Rene Higuita visit him. He thought he could kill members of his own cartel in or around the prison and get away with it. And it was only when I think he thought that they were going to come and he thought the authorities were going to kill him. I think he thought they were coming to pretend to move him to another prison, and they were going to sort of accidentally, on purpose, gun him down as he tried to escape, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think he thought, they're coming to kill me. I need to get out. So that was, I think, pure fight or flight kind of survival instinct. He escaped, and then he just did his best to kind of survive on the run, but it became increasingly hand to mouth. And you're right, I don't think he really had an exit strategy beyond that. It's hard to see how he could ever get back what he had once he was in that position.
Do you think all the money, and it kind of, because he's bought so much power, in his mind it became untouchable, not realising it was setting traps for himself, that he was actually making more mistakes?
Yeah, I think so. I think at times he was overconfident, and I think, like I said, that once the money starts to become an issue, then all those protections start to fall away. And I think there were times where he thought he could bully, bribe, force, buy his way in and out of situations, and sometimes that just wasn't possible, either because he was dealing with organizations like the DEA in America, where that he didn't really have that power, or he was dealing with international governments and the family tried to travel to Germany and get kind of asylum in Germany, and they were sent back. There were kind of all these aborted attempts to try and find some kind of safety and security somewhere, but basically the Colombian, and I think in particular the American authorities, put a lot of pressure around the world to say to people, don't harbor this guy. We will not support you if you offer him safe passage or safe haven. We want this guy brought to justice, so don't help him. And I think he either underestimated that could happen, or just didn't see that.
How does one of the biggest drug dealers of all time then smuggle one of the biggest footballers of all time into his prison? How does that operate? Listen, Maradona was that little gangster himself. Like when he went to Napoli and you see footage of him for Barcelona, kneeing people in the face, like he was proper, a man you probably wouldn't want to fuck with. But how he would have probably enjoyed that. Pablo Escobar would have been at they just sort of, not similar, but they had that personality. Like, how does it happen though? How does one of the biggest footballers end up involved with one of the biggest drug dealers?
Well, I think at the time, Diego Maradona was back in Argentina. He had been banned from playing football at all anywhere in the world for 15 months, I think. He tested positive for cocaine while he was at Napoli. And so he'd gone back to Argentina, and he was in Buenos Aires. And then while he was in Buenos Aires, he was arrested in an apartment with cocaine, in possession of cocaine. And he had this legal case going on in Argentina, and he was banned from playing football. And he was really kind of one of his lowest ebbs. He had a few low ebbs, but he was definitely in a dark place. He probably financially was not in the best shape then, and he wasn't allowed to play football, and he was kind of stuck in Argentina. And I think it was at that point that a representative of Pablo's approached him with an offer to play a highly lucrative exhibition match. And that's something that's very, very common in continental and especially in South American football, that professional footballers at a very young age get used to the idea that you have to play in these extra matches, these exhibition games, to raise money for your club that might help pay your contract, for example. So Maradona had played absolutely tons of sort of meaningless friendlies in order to generate revenue for his club so that they could actually afford his contract. So it's something he was very used to, getting paid cash for playing in a game. And I think he got offered to play in a football match in Colombia. He was banned from playing organized matches anywhere. He was at a low ebb. He probably needed the money. So I think, like a lot of people around Pablo, probably didn't ask too many questions. And as he told it years later, Maradona, he told the story a little bit in the press. I think he was kind of flown out to Colombia, and he was taken to this location, and lo and behold, it was La Catedral prison where Pablo had installed himself. And he was kind of smuggled in there, and he played a match with Pablo. I think he met Pablo first, and it's quite an interesting insight when I talked about how he saw himself, I think, as a footballer, and loved the idea that he was a bit of a player. And Maradona talks about how Pablo really went on at great length about how they were kindred spirits, and they had very similar upbringings, and to some extent they did have quite similar upbringings in kind of poor parts of their home countries in South America. But he clearly felt, that Diego Maradona and he were kind of almost like two kindred spirits, two souls. And I think they were very similar height, quite a similar build. I think Pablo kind of modeled his game a little bit on Maradona's game. I think he liked to play kind of inside right, like right wing, cutting in on his left foot, tried to be a little bit skillful, a little bit tricksy. And so, yeah, Maradona was the biggest and best footballing superstar in the world. I think Pablo just thought, I want to play football with him. So he got him over there. He got him into the prison. They played a game of football. They gave Maradona a briefcase full of cash, and invited him to stay on and party with them. And he partied with them. He said a parade of the most beautiful women he'd ever seen in his life kind of appeared out as if by magic in this prison. And there was just, drink and drugs and girls. And he partied all night with Pablo, and then he was kind of escorted out and flown back. So yeah, I think again, I don't think you go to those lengths if you don't love football in some weird twisted way. And kind of like I say, I think he felt he could have been a footballer. He liked to rub shoulders with them, you know.
But if he's playing football, you ain't tackling him. So he's scoring non-stop, thinking he's fucking Maradona. Nobody's tackling him.
No, they used to, you know, every now and again he might get a little tackle off one of the players whose, you know, salary he was paying at Atletico Nacional or Deportivo Independiente Medellin when he'd get these games together with the players of his clubs. And you know, he'd make sure they knew if they even put one or two tackles on him, like, what are you doing? I think everyone around them would be going, what are you doing? Don't tackle El Jefe, Don Pablo, you know, go easy on him. And I think, I think his team won more often than not. And I think, you know, if there was a penalty, he'd normally take it. And if someone like Rene Higuita was in goal, he'd normally dive the wrong way. And lo and behold, it would go in. So yeah, I think he was an average footballer at best. But like so much in his life, you know, a lot of what happened to him and around him was driven by fear. You know, fear was what motivated people to be loyal to him, to proclaim their love for him, to let him win, to go easy on him. Because, and it's something I sympathize greatly with the footballers of this era is, you know, how do you say no? How do you say no to Pablo Escobar? You know, it's a very difficult thing to do, to say no to someone who has the money, the resources to kill you, kidnap your family, blow up an airplane, do whatever he wants.
Yeah, let's talk about all that stuff. Like I say, that chapter in the book, Narco Terrorist, like, it's mad, like how deep and how powerful he was. Like, see, a lot of the stuff, the bombings and the killings, could a lot of stuff have been blamed on him anyway, even though he never, because obviously I've interviewed men from UDA, IRA, and there was certain things that were done that the media portrayed from the other side just to cause more conflict. Do you think there was a lot of stuff that could have been from someone else, but just portraying it as Pablo because he was enemy number one?
I mean, I think the automatic assumption when something happened of that ilk was that it was Pablo. And sometimes it was Pablo. Maybe most of the time it was Pablo. Possibly sometimes it was people within his organization. It might have been Jose Rodriguez Gacha, who was the guy who ran the Medellin cartel's operation in Bogota and went by the moniker El Mexicano, the Mexican. He wasn't Mexican, but he loved Mexican culture and music and mariachis and food and smuggling drugs through Mexico as well. So it could have been him. It could have been maybe someone going a little bit above and beyond. Like listeners might know of Pablo's kind of number one sicario, Popeye, who did a lot of his dirty work. You know, maybe he did some stuff without full sign off. Would you do stuff without Pablo knowing about it, though?
Not for his right hand man.
Probably not, right? You know, it's more than your life's worth to do something big that Pablo didn't know about. So I think most of the time it was him. I think if there were occasions when it wasn't, most of the time it didn't matter. And, you know, he would even accept the credit if because it wasn't him. It's all part of his reputation. It builds that culture of fear. But there was a lot of corruption going on, and there were a lot of different players in the game and kind of parties in the game, and there was also the Cali cartel, and there were also figures within Colombian politics and the upper echelons of Colombian power who had involvement in events. So it was a murky period. It's very hard to disentangle Pablo's tentacles from it because they were pretty much everywhere, and they probably were in most things.
Yeah, that was it. So Popeye, we'll touch on him because I read an article that he was having an affair, or not maybe an affair, but it was with one of Pablo's ex-girlfriends. I think Wendy, her name might have been. But I think Pablo phoned Popeye and says, this is his saying, Plato
Plomo.
Plomo.
Yeah.
What's that? It's like silver or lead or something?
Silver or lead, yeah. So it was one of his favorite sort of negotiating tools. It's what he became famous for, was this offer that he would give of plata or plomo. And plata is silver, money, and plomo is lead, aka bullet, death. So the offer is basically, you can take my money or you can die. And that's what he would offer, for example, to referees and football officials that he would coerce. So in 1989, when Atletico Nacional, which is the bigger of the two teams in Medellin, and it was the team that Pablo most controlled in Medellin, they became the first Colombian football side to win the Copa Libertadores, which is South America's Champions League, basically. And no Colombian side had ever won that. And I think he thought that was something that would be a huge feather in his cap as this kind of patron of football, and in his desire to have the people of Colombia, and particularly the people of Medellin, love him and owe him, was to bring this trophy that had never been won by a Colombian side to Colombia and to a Medellin team, which was his hometown. And so en route to them actually winning that trophy in 1989, becoming the first Colombian side ever to do that, he did attempt to, and in some instances successfully, coerce and bribe officials to help them. And that is the offer he would give them, and that is the offer he would give pretty much anybody he wanted to coerce and control, was plata or plomo, silver or lead, money or death. So you can accept my bribe or you're going to die. And, you know, most people took the money.
Because when I read it, he says that to his right-hand man, Popeye, he said that saying, and then apparently the girl was to meet Popeye in a restaurant or a bar, and he didn't show up, but the girl got 2 shots in the head, and Popeye drove by it again and see if it was done.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, you know, everybody in that cartel was in fear of Pablo and owed their loyalty and owed pretty much everything they had to Pablo. And if it was in the end to them just a girl, just a girlfriend, you know, it's no contest really. This is the guy who controls half the country, who has made you wealthier than you could ever imagine, who has killed more people and had you kill more people than, you know, you can count. I think they estimate that around 4,000 people died kind of directly as a result of Pablo and his activities. And Popeye killed a fairly large number of those people. So again, it is portrayed as a choice, but it's not really a choice. You know, you're choosing the girl or are you choosing me? Mm-hmm. If you're Pablo Escobar, I'm choosing you. Yeah,
because it all came on top as well. Was it Ortega, the referee? Was that a 2-2 game, I think? Was it Atletico Nacional or was it another team? And I think someone scored, he was the referee.
Yeah.
And I think the hit was put out. Was it Pablo's team?
Yeah,
was
it
that
was
Pablo's
Deportivo.
team?
It was Deportivo Independiente.
When did Pablo get involved with these teams? How did they get involved? Did they buy them, or was he just funding them? Was he the man behind the scenes? What was it?
Kind of, yeah, not overtly buying, but sort of elements of the other two aspects. So I think sort of credited as being his brother Roberto's idea. Roberto Escobar was Pablo's brother. He was a former champion cyclist, but then became an integral part of the cartel with Pablo. And he was the accountant. He was the money man for Pablo. And I think it was his idea originally to launder money through football. And it was very clever, especially back then. You know, football in somewhere like Colombia, hugely cash game, taking money on the turnstiles, very poor accountancy, record keeping, all that kind of stuff. Very easy to inflate your takings on the turnstiles, your taking on the concessions, your transfer fees, your salaries, your employee records, all that kind of stuff. Was a perfect way to launder lots and lots of money.
Was there tax in Colombia?
Financial tax. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, for Pablo, that was one of the big issues, as often is, isn't it, with organized crime, is how you declare your earnings and whether you've got unpaid tax. So this was a very clever way of laundering money, getting his illegal, dirty money washed by a football club that was effectively, you know, overestimating its costs and overheads, and so that money, obviously, if that's lost money, that's not subject to tax. So
again, it's not really love for the football. There's still another agenda of washing money. How many fans at a game?
I mean, you get thousands. They get sell-out matches, especially for the big games. So you're talking tens of thousands, like 30, 40,000. But you know, what started, I think, as an idea to launder money became something more for him, I think. Like I said, when he stopped being able to be in politics, lost his kind of dream of being president. I think he saw football as a way to win hearts and minds, kind of like a Roman emperor, you know, giving the people their bread and their circuses. It was a way for him to control the masses. And I think he also saw it as a kind of a competition with Cali. The Cali cartel had a control of America de Cali, one of the two big clubs in the town of Cali. And they had a lot of success winning the league. I think they won the Colombian domestic league something like 5 seasons in a row. They'd come very, very close a couple of times to winning the Copa Libertadores, but had never managed it. And I think Pablo thought, I'm going to get one of my teams to win the Copa Libertadores, to stick 2 fingers up at Cali, but also to bring joy to the people of Medellin and portray me as their kind of footballing savior. But it was, you know, it was kind of slightly covert. He wasn't, you know, the president of the football club. He hadn't bought it. But it was both laundering his money and it was accepting money that was coming from him directly or indirectly, to recruit and to pay wages and to build a successful football team.
So why did they get Ortega killed, the referee? Because that brought a lot of heat. I think one of the most famous referees, I think maybe in Colombia, I think he then resigned and wrote to FIFA. Like, why did they kill Ortega? Was it because of the 2-2 game? Yeah, and it was a late goal that he called off or something.
That's right. So it was one of the Medellin teams. I think it was DIM, Deportivo Independiente Medellin, were playing away. And it was, I think it was, as you said, I think it was 2-2 late on in the game. And a young Medellin player scored what should have been a last minute winner, to make it 3-2, and the goal was disallowed by the ref, and Pablo was absolutely furious by all accounts. And the story goes that he kind of said, I want him dead, and Popeye was there. But then what happened, because that had happened outside of Medellin, they waited a few weeks, and then there was the return fixture happened to happen just a few weeks later. And the same referee who'd made that decision was on the officials' team for the return game in Pablo's hometown of Medellin, obviously the kind of safest base of his operations. He was actually the linesman for the return game. He wasn't the referee. But that game was a really dull 0-0 draw by all accounts. And then afterwards he left with one of the other guys on the officials team, and they ended up trying to go to a restaurant and it was closed, and they were kind of walking down the street to go somewhere else for a drink or a bite to eat. And one of Pablo's assassins appears, I think it was Popeye, and kind of pushes the one official out of the way, says, don't worry, we're not here for you, basically. And then guns down the guy who had been the ref a few weeks earlier and disallowed that goal. And from what I read and what I found out about that story, it does just sound like it was one of Pablo's, you know, not infrequent bouts of just rage, personal anger. You know, he felt personally offended that this decision had robbed him of a victory for one of his football teams.
And the guy was shot 9 times.
Yeah.
Like, that's fucked up. Do you know what I'm saying? A lot of the stuff is fucked up, but like that, an innocent man, and you don't know what. I think someone says that it was corruption and he was paid by the other side not to let the goal. But again, does someone deserve to lose their life by a goal? Of course not. So how does then, like you say, and winning that cup and then playing AC Milan, the biggest team in the world at that time with all the superstars, a young Paolo Maldini, 21, Van Basten, I think he won the Ballon d'Or.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing sort of semi-forgotten bit of footballing history, I think.
Is that because of all the corruption and death?
I think so.
Before that?
I mean, I think it's only really more recently, perhaps with the sort of expansion of the global media and things like X, Twitter, you know, social media, 24-hour news, the Champions League, Sky, the Premier League. I think we now follow global football in a way that we didn't before. And I think when that match happened, which was 1989.
In Japan?
Yeah, in Tokyo. So it was in Tokyo, so it was a long way away from UK and Europe, but particularly from the UK.
Was Pablo there?
I don't think Pablo was there, no. But his...
Could he travel?
Back then, he would have been
Private planes and
Yeah, I mean, he did travel a lot. I'm trying to think. I don't think he was in a position. I think he was busy waging war
Yeah.
and under quite a lot of pressure at that time. And then when it came, for example, to Italian 90, his son went out to watch Colombia play in Italy for Italian 90, but Pablo wasn't there. So when that game happened in Tokyo, I think we don't know about it here because it's a tournament that, wasn't big in the UK, not least because we were banned from playing European competitions for quite a few years. And it was the game which was, the winners of the European Cup in Europe versus the winners of the Copa America, the Copa Libertadores, the Champions League of South America, effectively. And so, yes, this was the first time that a Colombian side had ever played in that match because a Colombian side had never won the Libertadores before. And it just so happened that, yes, it was in Tokyo and it was against this kind of all-time great AC Milan side. And actually, it was a really even game. And if you watch it back now, it's a very hotly contested game. There are periods when, this much less fancied Colombian side do really, really well and look like, they could even get a result against AC Milan. And it's only won in extra time. I think it's literally the 119th minute or something. This free kick takes a tiny little deflection and goes in and beats Rene Higuita. And there's basically no time for the Colombians to come back. But it's this sort of the pride of Medellin and the pride of Colombia, a team really forged by the money and investment and kind of vision of Pablo Escobar in some ways, representing Medellin and Colombia in Japan in front of, I think, 60,000 people against this all-time great AC Milan side. And they really go kind of toe-to-toe, and it's a really heavyweight clash. And it was in that game that AC Milan first really saw Andres Escobar play football. He was the centre-back for Atletico Nacional, and he was still very, very young then. But they clearly identified him at that point and kept tabs on him. And he was actually due to transfer to AC Milan in the summer of 1994 and was killed just before he could complete that transfer.
yeah, that's madness because Escobar was killed in '93, and the other Escobar, was there any relation between those two?
No, unrelated, relatively common name, and I think a source of confusion for people, but no relation at all. But Andres Escobar was the star player and captain of Atletico Nacional, and Pablo was effectively bankrolling and controlling that side. So they were not related, but they had a very close relationship, and Andres had to go and visit Pablo at his ranches and play in games that Pablo had organized, and always felt, I think, more than almost anyone else, very uncomfortable about that. He was a very upstanding young boy from a very kind of religious, conservative background, just wanted to play football, was just, by all accounts, a smart, intelligent, nice, well-behaved young lad who happened to be really good at football. But yeah, not related to Pablo.
Yeah, he was all about positivity and peace. So 1994 World Cup, he scores an own goal. A few weeks later, he's killed.
Yeah.
Is that just a straight-on hit, or is it just a coincidence that he scored an own goal and then killed? Like, what's the story behind that?
Again, it's something that's shrouded in rumor and innuendo and secrecy, and better journalists than me have, I think, tried to get to the bottom of it. And it's the subject of a really great documentary called The Two Escobars, which was made quite a few years ago now, but is a good attempt to tell this story in a slightly different way. It seems that he was to some extent in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I think it's bigger than that. He got back from the World Cup. He had scored this own goal against, of all people, the United States, that ended up seeing Colombia lose that game and ultimately saw them eliminated from the World Cup in the group stages. And throughout that World Cup, the squad, the management, the players had been under incredible pressure from individuals associated with the cartels and the cocaine trade back home, who had been letting them know in no uncertain terms that they had to do certain things, that the coach had to pick certain players and drop certain other players. all I think linked to a play for power and control following the death of Pablo, and also linked to lots of gambling that was going on around the matches. And so when he scored that goal, it was, a tragedy on the pitch. But I think if you watch it now, you can see the pressure that those players were under and the realization in their eyes that for them, those games, those results, that World Cup was much more than just football. It really was life or death. They were being told that if certain things didn't go their way or didn't happen, as were being decreed from back in Colombia, that their families would be kidnapped, would be killed, that they could be killed. And if you watch those games back now in hindsight, it's a really chastening experience to see. You see those players go out onto the pitch, ahead of the national anthems and everything, and all the Colombian fans are in the crowd going crazy and singing, and the Birdman's there waving his wings, and it's all this carnival of color and music and joy. And the players are just, you can tell they're terrified. And I think at the time people thought they were nervous, and they were, it was a big World Cup and a lot of pressure, and people had said maybe they could win the tournament.
Did they have a chance for the tournament?
I mean, you would always say that normally Argentina are going to be one of the favourites for a World Cup.
Yeah, Germany, Argentina, Italy.
Yeah.
England are always there.
Yeah. And Argentina, had won the World Cup in 1986. They had lost in the final of the World Cup in 1990. And in 1993, Colombia went to Buenos Aires, and Argentina had to win to guarantee qualification to the World Cup. And Colombia beat them in Buenos Aires 5-0 and took the automatic qualification spot from them. And Argentina had to qualify through a 2-legged playoff against Australia. And so I think if you say they qualified ahead of Argentina, they beat Argentina 5-0 in Buenos Aires in a game that Argentina had to win, then suddenly everybody starts to look at them and go, hang on, if these guys are actually better than Argentina, they must be pretty good.
Got a chance.
Yeah.
Where can you then separate between, are they a good team to then, has there been corruption, has other teams been threatened, has refs been threatened, linesmen been threatened, has managers been threatened to then not play as good against Colombia? Like, it must fuck with the players' confidence. Are they good? Are they just then corrupting their way to then getting results? Like, obviously Valderrama, great player, because I thought Colombia were in a lot more World Cups than we're actually in. They're not in many. I was born in 84, but I remember them, not 86, but I always remember like Valderrama, I think 90, 94, they were in that, like a bust of World Cups.
Yeah, they had 3 in a row in that period, but Italia 90 was their first World Cup for 28 years or so, I think, nearly 30 years. They'd only ever been in one World Cup before Italia 90, and that was in the 60s. And I don't think they won a game in that World Cup. So Italia 90 was the first World Cup for a whole generation, only the second World Cup ever for Colombia. But they did pretty well. They got out of the groups. They very nearly beat Cameroon, who were the surprise package of that World Cup.
They got the semis, I think, Cameroon.
Yeah.
I don't know if they beat England or England beat them.
They lost to England, didn't they? I think 3-2 or something. Yeah. So that was a pretty good World Cup for Colombia, a sort of nice surprise, Italia 90, really. By USA 94, they were sort of starting to be viewed a bit differently. They had the nucleus of the same side from Italia 90, but by this point they'd added Faustino Asprilla as the kind of real goal threat up front. They still had prime Carlos Valderrama. Andres Escobar was in his prime by that point. Probably the only thing that they were missing was René Higuita. He was their goalkeeper, but he had been imprisoned in Colombia for his role in paying a ransom. And by the time he was let out of prison, he was out of shape. It was viewed to be too difficult to reintegrate him into the team.
I watched his documentary. It was brilliant.
It's really good, isn't it?
Brilliant.
Yeah, he's another crazy character.
Football needs that, though. See the way he used to just catch the ball, run out, take free kicks, penalties. Like, he was a proper character. People gravitate. It's like Gazas and that. Obviously, there's a bit of dysfunction there and there's something not quite right, but people gravitate towards the vulnerability. And once you actually understand his story as well, you realise what he's actually went through. But he was good friends with Escobar, was he not? He was.
His story is brilliant, and like you say, it does interact with Pablo's. And again, he was the goalkeeper for the team that Pablo bankrolled and controlled the most at Atletico Nacional, and he was the goalkeeper when they won the Copa Libertadores. And the manager of that side, Francisco Pacho Maturana, was also the manager of Colombia at that time. So there was this whole nucleus. The Colombian side was really built on Atletico Nacional, and Atletico Nacional was built on Pablo's money and the ambition of Pablo and of coach Maturana to create a team that represented Medellin and represented Colombia. So Atletico Nacional in those days was 100% Colombian. All the players were Colombian. Most of them were from Medellin itself. Most of them grew up as kids playing on pitches that Pablo had built and funded. And the manager was Colombian and had to some extent been picked by Pablo himself. And that transferred to the national team and gave a really strong spine to that team. And then you add Valderrama, and then you add Asprilla, and you had a really, really good side going into USA 94. And I think that's what I wanted my book to help people understand, because I think there is a slight perception that they weren't that good, that they choked, that they bottled it, that it was, to do with the pressure and they just didn't perform on the pitch. And I think it was to do with pressure, but it was to do with pressure of, we're going to kill you if you don't win, or we're going to kidnap your family if you don't drop this player and pick this player.
Why would they do that though? Like the goal to get them to World Cup, your underdogs, you'd have just been celebrating Colombia's in the World Cup 86, 90, but then to then beat Argentina 5-0 and then the pressure, and then Escobar being that winner mentality, just wanted to win. So if you don't win, I'm killing you. Like why switch like that? If it's because let's be honest, if Escobar's not there, would Colombia really be in the 86, 90, 94? They wouldn't be, because of the funding with Athletic. That's only what I'm getting from your story. So why switch it?
I think it's because Pablo was dead by USA 94. So I think what happened at USA 94, and this is my opinion, this is my theory from researching and writing the book, is that Pablo did want success for Colombian football, not just for the teams of Medellin, but I think the fact that Maturana and the players of Atletico Nacional were allowed to form the basis of that Colombia side, that Pablo did want Colombia as a footballing nation to be successsul. And I think he would have loved Colombia to win the World Cup, especially in America, again, to stick two fingers up at the Yankees. And I think if Pablo had been alive, and especially if Pablo had been both alive and at the height of his power, rather than, on the run and running out of power, I think it would have gone down very differently. I think he died on the 2nd of December, 1993, the day after his 43rd birthday. That's right. And not that long after seeing on the telly, I think he watched, while he was in one of his safe houses, he watched Colombia beat Argentina. And it's supposed to be perhaps the last day that he was truly, truly happy, was when Colombia thrashed Argentina in Buenos Aires. Not long after that, he was killed, died, shot dead on a rooftop in Medellin. And so that was at the end of 93. World Cup happened summer of 94. And I think in that period, the death of Pablo and the kind of disintegration of the Medellin cartel created a bit of a power vacuum and a bit of a sort of land grab that, the Cali cartel obviously positioned themselves at the forefront as that happened. But I think there was an awful lot going on in organized crime and criminal circles in Colombia because of the death of Pablo. And I think that side, Andres Escobar was the golden boy of the team that Pablo bankrolled. The manager was the manager of the team that he bankrolled. Lots of the other players were also playing for Atletico Nacional. I think if he'd been alive and well and in power, they would have been supported by him. And nobody would have been able to get to them and threaten them and undermine them in the way that they were. And so I think the fact that he died before that World Cup meant that there was
more pressure.
Yeah, there was the opportunity then for people.
So do you think they would have had more safety if Escobar was alive?
I think he would have been their sort of protector, really.
Because he did love these players. He loved that goalkeeper.
Yeah.
Like, they were proper friends. Like, what a documentary. Like, people go and watch that. I It's not in English, obviously, it's in Colombian, but it's fucking great, man. Like, to understand the story, where they came from, and how the connection is.
Yeah.
There's a lot more deeper to that. But how much pressure does it then put on the Colombians when players are getting killed? Like, does that totally then become a place you don't want to travel to? The teams then become disliked, the players become disliked. Like, it's okay, maybe people being done for drugs, or Maradona get done for sniffing coke, or drug cheats, but to be killing players, like, that's totally fucking next level. Like, how damaging that is to Colombia.
I think that's the thing. I think the sort of double-edged sword of everything to do with Pablo, you know, is kind of visible in what happens with football. I think he is at least partially, quite significantly responsible for the growth and success of Colombian football in the 80s and 90s, and the fact that they got to Italia 90, they got to World Cup USA 94, and the kind of halo effect of that meant that they still managed to be just about good enough to get to France 98, but they weren't really that good by then. But I think he did help to grow the sport in Colombia, to retain talent. He was able to offer wages and bonuses to players at his clubs that meant they didn't need to go abroad to make money. They could stay, they could play in Medellin and still do really well, which wouldn't have otherwise been the case. So there was a whole generation of Colombian talent that was identified on pitches that he'd built, that was brought into the setup of the clubs that he effectively owned, and that had a sort of pipeline, you know, from the barrios of Medellin to the Colombian national side. And that continuity and that pipeline, I think, really benefited Colombian football during his lifetime. The flip side of that is, as soon as he's dead, as soon as the Medellin cartel falls, by that point, El Mexicano is also gone. Very soon after that, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, who run the Cali cartel, are arrested. That era that I kind of call Narco Ball, the Narco Ball era in my book, from the very late 70s through the 80s and into the very early 90s, that era sort of starts to come to an end around death of Pablo 93, failure of USA 94, death of Andres Escobar right after that World Cup failure, and then the prosecution of the Cali cartel leaders. And I think by that point, the war on drugs, the DEA, the Colombian authorities, they're sort of starting to win aspects of that war. Life is much, much, much harder and more dangerous and more difficult for the cartels and for the people involved in the cocaine trade in Colombia. And so I think from their heyday, when they had all this money and all this power and they could throw it all at football and kind of play fantasy football with these teams and these players, that's no longer important. You know, staying alive, staying out of prison, trying to keep your operation running, staying one step ahead of the DEA and the authorities is what they're trying to do. And football becomes an unnecessary distraction. It becomes, you know, a waste of time and money and energy. And so when that withdrawal happens from football, it again leaves a kind of vacuum. And I think Colombian football suffered massively in the aftermath of that. Had a couple of kind of false dawns with winning the Copa America in 2001, but really it took until 2014 and a whole new generation, James Rodriguez and Guillermo Cuadrado, and that World Cup to kind of finally put an end.
Quarters or last 16?
It was quarters, yeah.
He's had a good team, man. Rodriguez scored a few goals. I think he went to Barcelona or Real Madrid.
Real, yeah, he scored. He was Golden Boot. He got 6 goals. He scored the Puskás winning goal that year for the volley against Uruguay.
Top corner.
Which I could watch that goal every day till I die, I think, and die happy.
Who's your biggest rivalry, Colombia?
I mean, it feels like it. Again, as somebody who grew up in London, I'm sort of separated from that. And I think I grew up always thinking that, I think in England or in the UK or in parts of Europe, we do have that quite tribal mentality of like, if you're English, you know, maybe the Scottish supporters hate you because you're English.
Yeah,
and if you're England, you probably want, you know, France to lose, or you probably want Germany to lose. It's very much your nation against everybody else.
England are against everybody else.
Yeah.
England, Scotland, England, Ireland, England, Wales, England, France. Like, England do bring that where it is more a rivalry game every game.
It's very tribal. I think one thing I sort of belatedly learned from my mum, really, I think, is that to some extent in South America, it's much more collegiate, because I think a lot of South America feels like you're South American, and it's it's South America versus everybody, and to some extent you celebrate the success of anybody from South America.
Brazil, Argentina.
So and there's been a lot of overlap between Colombia and Argentina in terms of players and coaches, and the manager of the Colombian side at the moment is an Argentinian. We've had successful Argentinian managers of the national team many years before. Even Alfredo Di Stefano played in Colombia when the strike happened in Argentina, and Colombia was able to tempt a lot of players to come and play in Colombia. So it's slightly different. There are huge rivalries, but there is also a sort of collegiate support for each other, I think. So, but I think there's a pretty strong rivalry with Uruguay on a footballing basis. Obviously, they started out being one of the great footballing nations. I think they won the very first football World Cup. Yeah. And Colombia have never won a World Cup.
I think any South American team has got a possibility with the right players coming through at the right time. There's just something about them. They always get far in competitions.
I think they're better prepared now than they have been in the past. They came so close to winning the Copa America last summer. They lost in the final to Argentina.
1-0.
Yeah, right at the death. And I think the only difference between those two teams, I think Colombia were at least a match for Argentina throughout that game, and really it turned on squad depth and substitutions, and Argentina were able to bring on 3 world-class players that combined to score their goal, whereas the Colombian replacements that came on, you would probably, in the cold light of day, look at those changes. Whenever they had to make changes, you would normally look at it and say they're weakening their starting 11 to bring those players on. So
how big is the Copa America? Is that like your World Cup? How is it a massive? Obviously, we've got the Euros here, which is massive.
Yeah,
we would treat that like a World Cup, but is that as big in South America?
I think it is. I mean, South America is football mad. South America doesn't have the distraction of a lot of the other sports that we might have here, whether it's Six Nations rugby or World Cup rugby, or all kinds of other sports that we have here. Football is the one. And the Copa America is huge. Like you say, it's second only really to the World Cup. And it is huge. So yeah, sad that they got so close and then fell at the final hurdle, but they had a really good Copa America. And after that, I thought they've got a really good chance in America, Mexico and Canada in 2026 next year.
LA, is it LA?
It's all around. It's all around North America. I think the question marks for them will be between now and then. What happens? The sort
Have you qualified?
No, not definitely, but I think there's a very good chance. The group. Traditionally, South American qualifying has been really, really hard because everybody plays everybody twice, home and away, and it's like a one massive league. Whereas in Europe, you're probably going to get paired with a couple of weaker teams in your group. If you're England, you might San Marino or someone. So here you've got to play everyone. And one of the biggest things that I think people don't appreciate is the geographical element of that you might play Bolivia at a huge altitude, and then Colombia play down on the Caribbean coast in Barranquilla. And the difference in altitude, humidity, temperature, all that kind of stuff is absolutely enormous. It's nothing like just going to play in Munich or something. How's that different from playing in Liverpool or Manchester or London? There are huge differences, and they really leverage those home advantages. But this qualification, there's some extra places available for South American qualifying. So I think it's the top 6 automatically qualify out of 10, and then 7th place goes into a playoff. So there's only 3 out of 10 that are going to be automatically out. And Colombia have started very well, had a little blip recently, but probably, hopefully, have already done enough to be there. So then I think it's just, is James Rodriguez still fit and going? He's now playing in Mexico. Is he at the top level? My big hope was that John Duran was going to be the answer to our number 9 centre forward position, something we struggled in the Copa. He didn't really play much, and we didn't really have a world class centre forward. And it was really James and Luis Diaz and, goals from elsewhere. Although the guy who did fill that void in the end did do quite well, but I just don't think he's as naturally talented as John Duran. But again, the worry with him is that he's just gone to Al Nassr in Saudi Arabia. And
I just seen his goal though he scored last week. It was a peach.
It's a good goal. Yeah. It is a good goal. But hopefully, my hope is he stays fit. He plays every game instead of being on the bench at Villa, so he gets minutes, but hopefully he doesn't get injured. He gets confidence by hopefully banging in a hatful of goals. But will he arrive undercooked because he's not playing Champions League football? He's not playing with the best players week in, week out. He's not testing himself. My worry is that he'll just kind of rock up to the World Cup and he just won't be...
Make up the numbers.
Yeah, he just won't be absolutely on it.
But again, it's the last 10 years has been successful. Do you think with the World Cup quarters and then the final, the Copa, do you think people then forget late 80s, 90s, the troubles with Colombia? Do you think people can then move on and treat Colombia as a fucking proper national team?
I think that's what I hope, and what I hope my book has played a small part in is like positioning Colombia as a country that people might be interested in, finding kind of new fans for Colombia as a country and as a football team. And I think now so much time has passed, and that era of Pablo and the cartels and narco football has more or less passed. Yes, Colombia, like a lot of countries, still has issues, and there are still issues with crime and drugs and all kinds of things. But modern Colombia is completely different to how it was when it was no longer safe for my mother to take me there, for example. I've been back with my wife. My sister went with her husband recently. We've still got family out there. It is a thriving, modern, wonderful country with so much to explore, and it's a great place to visit. So what I hope is that now when people think of Colombia, they do think of football, they think of the Amazon, they think of beautiful women, they think of Shakira, they think of Carol G, they think of Juan Pablo Montoya, they think of music and food and culture and history and, positive things. Something that I was a bit torn in writing the book is kind of retelling some of that story of the dark times.
I think you've got to though. I think because people know it. You can't sugarcoat it. Obviously, maybe your younger generation, but people are still intrigued by it. And like you said, as much as there are a lot of negatives, there's still a lot of positives. And would have Colombia have been a force in the 80s and 90s and going to the World Cup if it wasn't for Pablo Escobar? I don't think they would be, but there must have been some love for the sport. Like everybody, if you grew up with a sport that never leaves your blood, you just love it. Like even me, I say I don't want to. There's too much football on now, so I'll try not watch it as much. But I'll always BBC. I'm looking at all the results, every game, every league, because there's teams I like in probably every league, and I want to do well. So it's just in your blood. We're playing football Monday night. Like it's just you can never leave it. I still think I'm fucking 21. No, I've got the brain of a 21-year-old, but the body ain't so much. With the knees and the calves are killing me. But it's just such a beautiful sport where it's if you're playing a football team, it's the bond, it's the brotherhood. It's like going into battle. You want to fight for these people, win for these people. They just done it at a different level. But everybody's got a past. It's just so happens. Every country has got leaders or dictators or destructions happened. It just is what it is. But it's obviously you being Colombian and trying to not put a negative light on it, but you can't really forget what's happened either.
I think it does a disservice to those players and what they went through to pretend that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. Like I say, otherwise you just look at it and go, Colombia, USA 94, they weren't that good. They lost to America. They lost to a good Romania side, then they lost to America, and they beat a Roy Hodgson managed Switzerland, but that wasn't enough. And they just weren't that good. And I think, like I say, I wanted to set the record straight about those players and that team. And I think I wanted people to see why, for someone who is Colombian or is a fan of Colombian football or the Colombian team, why it might mean so much, why it might mean more, having gone through all of that. want them to do well so badly, want to support them wherever they go. It's a funny thing about sort of having as part of your background and part of your ethnicity, a country that is kind of a smaller country on the world stage like Colombia. I grew up in England, and there are successful people who have come from England in every single walk of life and have been for hundreds of years. Famous musicians, actors, directors, sports stars, just about everything you can think of, there's a British hero or multiple British heroes. And with a country like Colombia, they are, few and far between. And they have to, you have to celebrate them as a sort of proud Colombian when one of your countrymen or women does well on the international stage. That's a huge deal. Someone like Shakira, someone like Juan Pablo Montoya, something like Carlos Valderrama, Faustino Asprilla, they become national heroes. Rene Higuita, they become national icons because
For life.
yeah, for life, because they are flag bearers for the country. They are proof that you can succeed if you come from that country. And that is quite different, I think, from some of the bigger, more Western established kind of superpowers.
Yeah.
So
They embrace being successful because because a lot of places there's like third world, there's not much really happening. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of poverty here as well, but there's a lot more opportunity here. Like you say, there's always someone British in acting, in football, rugby, golf. There's always somebody flying the flag. But I think people are more patriotic sometimes in these South American countries because they want to prove that it can be done.
yeah, I mean, Faustino Asprilla was the first Colombian to play in English football.
I'm surprised at
and it's
that, though.
1996. Juan Pablo Montoya was the first Colombian to race in Formula One, and that's in the 2000s. For how many decades have you been able to support a British racing driver in the top of racing motorsport for decades? So
What's the population?
it's tens of millions. I think it's like 80 million. You put me on the spot there. It's a big country. I mean, what's amazing about Colombia is, and again, I hope that in this book people feel my passion for my motherland, my passion for football, my passion for Colombian football. And I want people to kind of look at it on the map and go and read about it, and maybe one day book a holiday or something there, because it is beautiful, and it's got Caribbean coastline, it's got Pacific coastline, it's got the Andes mountains, it's got the Amazon jungle and rainforest, it's got coffee growing regions, it's got high altitude snowy mountains, it's got pink dolphins. Snow? Yeah, it's got the Andes.
I went to Costa Rica. I don't know how far it is from Colombia, but Costa Rica was beautiful.
Yeah, it's way bit further west, but I mean, Costa Rica's like a tiny little microcosm. It's but it's got huge biodiversity, and same in Colombia. I mean, it's got amazing animal life, but also history and culture and music and all those things that are nothing to do with Pablo and the cartels and cocaine. And especially now, I think the country has really worked very, very hard to put it in the past. And I think that's why, for some people, this story, for Colombians, the story of Pablo is something they've done and dealt with and want to leave behind and move on and forget about. I think for everybody else, not that many people know the full story. Certainly not that many people perhaps know and appreciate the full story of its relationship with football.
Yeah.
And so that's why I wanted to tell that story, not for Colombians who will know that, but for everybody else, for British readers, for American readers, Australian readers.
But with true crime being such a top topic, is it difficult then for yourself if you're seeing things on Netflix all the time, Amazon, books, and is it just a case of it is what it is? Like, you kind of got to embrace it, but is it difficult to move on when it's constantly refreshed in your memory?
I think, I think, Colombians, especially sort of native Colombians who grew up there, who are still there, I totally understand why, perhaps a lot of them reacted to series like Narcos on Netflix or Griselda, where, like I say, I think for people who lived through it, for people who have been immersed in that history and lived that history, they don't want to keep hearing about it. They don't want to for it to keep being told. But, I do think it's important that the rest of the world knows these stories and that the rest of the world doesn't forget this history. And there's definitely something about the story of Pablo and the cartels and football that I think resonates with a modern readership and a modern football fan, because there's definitely still issues in the beautiful game with sports washing, with, where your money is coming from, who controls your club, why do they control that club? I think there are lots of parallels that can be drawn between what Pablo kind of started doing in the 80s and what's happening today.
Do you think he was ahead of his time then? Do you think there's people, chairmans and or people funding clubs now who are in the back who are not washing money, but it's more organised with crime?
I think we'd be foolish to think that there isn't. I think it's very easy to kind of say that a story like this is South American and Colombian and it's cocaine and, it's kind of course it is, because it's, criminal and dirty and whatever. I think we like to think that nothing like that happens over here to our game, whether that's here being England or the UK, or whether it's being Europe or, but I think we've seen that there have been big scandals in Italy, for example, in Italian football, in Serie A, big clubs, getting in trouble like Juventus. This can happen to the biggest clubs in the biggest leagues, that it can turn out that there have been wrongdoings.
Did they get relegated for that?
Yeah, they did. Yeah,
Years
they got
ago,
sent
10
down to
years ago,
Serie B.
maybe,
Yeah. And they were kind of lucky enough, or had enough financial muscle, that they could keep a few good players and come back up again.
Rangers was the same. Rangers done that, I think. But what was it? The wages. The wages. They find that a loophole, but they get put to the third division.
Yeah, and there's obviously ongoing at time of press, as it were, as we talk. We still haven't got a resolution to the case against Manchester City, and there are still lots of questions, I think, being asked about the fit and proper persons criteria, and who should be allowed to own football clubs, and how many can they own, and where can they own them, and what control does that give them, and why are they doing that? And like I say, it's not necessarily laundering illegal money in the way that Pablo was doing, but perhaps it is a powerful tool to speak to the people, right? It's powerful for reputational sports washing, and there are definitely players out there, I don't mean football players, but sort of players in the global game of geopolitics and high finance and sport, who see a benefit in being associated with controlling top level sport.
But people used to buy a club because it was a love for their club, the club that they grew up with. I think Elton John to not buy Watford or something, or like people love football then 80s, 90s, but now it's just become so lucrative. It's a business. It's people who may be involved in oil or whatever, they want to then fund it. Look at Manchester United. Who was not Ibrahimovic? Who was the Chelsea? Abramovich. But you don't know, like I say, but it's just become so lucrative. They're making billions. It's not just a case of making this and that. If you get a team from the first division, second division, take them to the Premier League, you're making mega bucks with the sponsorship deals, the strips. It's just so lucrative, but that is what it is. Just before we finish up, see when because we never touched on it much, but when they blew up the airplane, why did they do that?
So Pablo was trying to assassinate a politician, and the politician he wanted to kill was supposed to be on that flight, on that plane, and so they recruited a guy to take a bomb on board the plane. And as the story goes, I think it was a young lad, and I think he didn't know that it was a bomb. He was told he was going to be recording a conversation, and it was a recording device, and he was going to use it to record a conversation that was happening just ahead of him on the plane. So they put this lad with this bomb in this briefcase and a button to start the recording device, which was going to blow up. But then what happened was the politician, I can't remember why exactly he didn't get on the flight. I think either he was just delayed and missed the flight, or change of plan and decided not to go. But I think it was serendipitous. I think it was luck. I don't think he knew that was going to happen. He just, in the end, at the very last minute, did not get that plane. And so the plan went ahead. They didn't realize that he hadn't got on the plane. This Avianca flight with 100 people on board took off. And then the kid set the recording going, but it wasn't a recording. It was a bomb, blew the whole plane out of the sky, killed several people on the ground as well. And all for nothing, because the person he wanted killed was not on it. And I think that was kind of the darkest moment. That was kind of the most obvious narco-terrorism moment, where I think everyone went, you can't come back from that. He can't ever pretend to be anything other than what he truly is, because he's just killed over 100 people. as an act of terrorism. Like I say, to kill a politician, and sort of the irony of it all was that the guy he wanted dead wasn't on the plane.
Yeah, that's next level. Listen, if it's drug lords killing drug lords or whatever, then it's fair game for me. But to blow up innocent people, that, like you say, there's no coming back from that. It was only a matter of time before they got killed. Let's touch on your other work just before we finish up, because I think it's important. What was the 1966 World Cup going missing?
Yeah, so before I was a writer, I worked in documentaries, and some of the stuff I did had sort of a similar tone to this book, and kind of helped me find my way to writing this book, really. So I my role in television was coming up with ideas for factual TV programs, for documentaries, whether that's documentary films or series or single documentaries. And I particularly like historical stories. I particularly like stories that have a bit of true crime, a bit of that kind of thriller element to them. And so, yeah, one of the ideas of mine that ended up being a documentary was the story of the World Cup, the theft of the World Cup in 1966, and the kind of competing theories around who might have done that and why. And this kind of more recent theory that came out through a journalist who delved into it was around some East End gangsters who had been casing out the exhibition that was holding the World Cup, but was actually also an exhibition of various rare stamps, some of which were very, very valuable. And I think the theory goes, as was explored in the film, that they were planning on possibly stealing some stamps, and in the end decided to nick the World Cup while they were there. And then all the heat that came down on them from the police made them think, what have we done? They had to find a way to kind of give it back. And so they left it out for a potentially sort of criminal associate or sort of friend to find it with his dog. So yeah, that was one of the documentaries that I helped develop when I was working in TV.
The Sri Lankan Civil War, is that get nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah,
is that correct?
That was another one that I was very lucky and proud to play a small part in. So I used to work at a company called ITN Productions, who listeners might well know from making the news for Channel 4, for ITV. I think they also make Channel 5 news. Massive international news gathering organization, and I worked for their documentary department, and a story had come into us from the guy who was the, I think, deputy editor of Channel 4 News at the time, a guy called Ben De Pere, who had been looking into the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War and had uncovered this kind of story of the true events that had happened at the end of that civil war, which was basically a case of kind of state-sponsored genocide, really, of the Tamils in the no-fire zone. And so he had kind of sent off this as a thought while he was on a red-eye plane back from America, I think. And it came into our office, and I was the one who was tasked with turning that concept into the idea for a documentary that could then go to Channel 4 television. And in the end, it was commissioned by Channel 4, and it was made into a documentary film called Sri Lanka's Killing Fields. And that ended up being taken and shown to the UN, and helped to kind of kickstart a new investigation into the end of that war, and the sort of possible war crimes that happened.
Mm-hmm. Plans for the future, David?
I'm currently writing another book. I can't say too much about it. It's not yet public knowledge, but I'm writing another book for my same publisher, which I think if readers have enjoyed Narco Ball, I think they will enjoy. It's very similar world, sport and kind of nefarious activity and crime. So it's that kind of fusion of kind of crime thriller with high stakes sporting action. So hopefully people will enjoy that. And yeah, that's going to be my next book. Should be out ahead of the next World Cup, hopefully.
Listen, David, coming on and giving me a time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Great speaker. Listen, great book. I'll leave the link in the description for people to go and buy. I wish you all nothing but the best for the future, and I look forward to see what you do.
Thank you, James. Thanks, everyone.
God bless you, mate. Take care.